At 4:30 in the morning on July 21st, 1880, a small leak opened at the top of an unfinished tunnel, buried 60 feet under the Hudson River. It was no larger than a man's hand. Within minutes, compressed air was rushing out of it, and river silt was pouring in. 28 men were inside. 8 of them would reach the airlock alive. The others would remain there, sealed beneath the riverbed, while engineers above stood on the Jersey City shore and tried to understand what had just happened. The project would not move forward in any real sense for the next 18 months. What stopped it was not money nor politics. It was the river bottom itself. By the 1860s, the Hudson River had become the largest single obstacle to commerce on the east coast of the United States. Manhattan was a peninsula crowded with industry, finance, and immigrant labor, and yet every railroad coming from the south, the west, or the interior of the country ended its tracks on the New Jersey side. Goods and passengers had to be carried across the water on ferries. In ordinary weather, the crossing took roughly 20 minutes. In fog or ice, it could take hours, or it could fail altogether. The winter of 1867 was one of the worst on record. Ferries got stuck in ice. Coal shipments stopped. Manhattan came close to running out of fuel. A man named DeWitt Clinton Haskin, an engineer who had made his money on the California Pacific Railroad and on silver mines in Utah, was on one of those stranded ferries. By the time he reached shore, he had decided that the only durable answer was a tunnel. A bridge had been studied repeatedly and rejected. The Hudson at that point was a mile wide, with shipping channels too active to obstruct, and a riverbed that consisted in long stretches of soft mud reaching down dozens of feet before it touched anything solid. Engineers of the period believed a bridge there would be impossible to anchor without piers driven down to bedrock, an undertaking no one in the country knew how to attempt at that depth. A tunnel, in theory, could simply be threaded through the silt below the river. In theory. Haskin incorporated his Hudson Tunnel Railroad Company in 1873 and began sinking a construction shaft at the foot of 15th Street in Jersey City the following year. Almost immediately, he was sued by the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, which ran ferries across the same stretch of water and saw a tunnel as a threat to its business. The injunction held the project in place for 5 years. Equipment sat under tarps. Investors grew restless. Work did not resume until late 1879. When it did, the method was unusual for its time. Haskin chose not to use a tunneling shield, the heavy steel cylinder that British engineers had been refining since the 1860s, for soft ground work. Instead, he relied on compressed air. The plan was to push the air pressure inside the tunnel up to roughly 35 pounds per square inch, enough, in theory, to hold back the river above and keep the silt walls in place, while workers laid an iron and brick lining behind them. Men entered through an airtight chamber at the rear, pausing several minutes inside to let their bodies adjust, and then worked at the unsupported face with shovels and picks. The silt of the Hudson, when it carried just the right amount of moisture, behaved almost like clay. It would stand on its own. Haskin had observed this and designed his entire method around it. What he did not fully account for was that the silt was not uniform. Its moisture changed from yard to yard. Its density changed. The pressure required to hold back water at the bottom of the tunnel was much greater than the pressure required at the top, where the silt was thinner and the river was closer. Any single value of compressed air would always be too much in one place and too little in another. The men working the face could not see this, and neither could the engineers reading the gauges. By the summer of 1880, the tunnel had advanced about 300 feet into the river. Work continued through the night in shifts. On the early morning shift of July 21st, the assistant superintendent on duty was a man named Peter Woodland. He was English by birth, an experienced sandhog, and had been with the project since it resumed the previous autumn. A few minutes past 4:30, Woodland noticed a hiss at the top of the tunnel face. The compressed air inside the workings had found a soft pocket in the silt above and was escaping upward. As the air went out, the seal failed. River water and mud began coming in through the same opening. Woodland understood immediately what was happening. He ran to the airlock at the rear of the tunnel, opened it, pushed 8 men inside, and sealed the door behind them. He did not go in himself. The 8 men in the lock survived. Woodland and 19 others did not. The tunnel filled with water and collapsed silt within minutes. When daylight came, there was a visible disturbance on the surface of the river above the tunnel line, a churning of mud and air bubbles that lasted for hours. Boats slowed and watched it. The newspapers in both states ran the story by the afternoon edition. It took 6 months to recover the bodies of the men who had been trapped. The flooded chamber could not simply be pumped out. The walls had failed. The silt was no longer holding. At the inquest that followed, Haskins stood up and declared that he, and he alone, was responsible for the plans and for their execution. The statement protected his employees, but it permanently damaged the company's standing with its lenders, several of whom withdrew their support within the month. What followed was the long pause that defined the whole project. The tunnel, as a working construction site, was effectively shut down for the next year and a half. There was no formal announcement. Funding continued to trickle in. Investors continued to attend meetings, but no useful tunneling was possible until engineers could solve the problem the river had just demonstrated. The first task was recovery. A cofferdam was driven into the riverbed above the failed section, enclosing a rectangle of water and mud that could then be drained. Inside the cofferdam, a pneumatic caisson, roughly 40 feet long and 24 feet wide, was sunk down to the level of the tunnel itself. From inside that caisson, workers reached the buried chamber, removed the dead, and began the slow process of rebuilding the damaged lining in masonry rather than brick. The cofferdam alone took months to install in the moving river. The caisson took longer. While that was happening, the engineering review was running in parallel. A new chief engineer, General William Suey Smith, was brought in. Smith was a respected figure in American civil engineering, with experience on bridge foundations and pneumatic caisson work in the Midwest. He looked at Haskins' design and found it wanting in 3 specific places. He introduced changes that should have been part of the original plan from the beginning. First, Smith installed a permanent bulkhead near the tunnel face, with its own dedicated airlocks, so that workers could be sealed off in seconds if pressure failed again. The bulkhead Haskin had used was a simple wall of concrete with a single airlock, suitable for routine entry but useless in an emergency. Second, Smith replaced the brick lining with concrete, which could be poured in continuous sections and was less likely to crack under uneven pressure. Third, he added a pressurized discharge pipe that allowed excavated silt to be carried out of the tunnel without breaking the air seal at the rear, which had been a daily source of small pressure losses. By January 1882, 18 months after the blowout, a delegation of about 100 engineers from the American Society of Civil Engineers was given a tour of the rebuilt workings. They walked through the new airlock, inspected the concrete walls, and were taken later that same day to look at the Brooklyn Bridge, which was still rising over the East River under Washington Roebling. The Hudson Tunnel was alive again, but it was not the same project. The river had taught its lesson, and the lesson had cost 20 lives, the company's reputation, and a year and a half of construction time. The story did not end with the 18-month pause. The tunnel itself was never finished by the men who started it. Haskins' main financial backer, Trenor W. Park, died in late 1882, and the company suspended construction again that November. A second blowout the following year shook investor confidence further. Haskin restarted the work twice and finally exhausted himself in 1887, with about 1,600 feet of tube completed and abandoned beneath the river. A British firm took over the contract in 1888, bringing in something Haskin had refused to use. James Henry Greathead, an engineer working in London, had developed a tunneling shield specifically designed for soft riverbed material. The Greathead shield was a heavy steel cylinder slightly wider than the tunnel itself, pushed forward by hydraulic jacks while workers excavated through openings in its face. The British team, working with Haskin's old compressed air method behind the shield, pushed the work another 1,600 feet before the firm ran out of money in a financial crisis in 1891. For the next 10 years, the half-built tube sat full of water, useful to no one, while the city above it kept growing. In 1902, a Tennessee lawyer named William Gibbs McAdoo bought the abandoned workings. McAdoo was not an engineer. He was a man with a talent for raising money and choosing the right people to spend it. He hired Charles Jacobs as his chief engineer. Jacobs had built New York's first underwater tunnel, a small gas main bore beneath the East River, and he understood the Hudson silt as well as anyone alive. He used a mechanical shield, electric locomotives to remove spoil, and an air pressure of 38 pounds per square inch. Progress, for the first time in the project's history, was rapid. But the Hudson had one more obstacle waiting. As the shield approached the Manhattan side, it ran into solid rock, a reef of bedrock sitting only 1 to 16 feet above the planned tunnel grade, cut directly across the path. The original plans had not predicted it, because no one had drilled deep enough at that point to find it. The silt above the reef was thin in places, and any blasting risked a blowout straight through the riverbed to the open water above. Jacobs dynamited through the reef, one careful charge at a time, dumping clay onto the riverbed from barges overhead to thicken the cover before each blast. The work took roughly 11 months. One man was killed when a charge failed. Several blowouts occurred and were stopped through methods that border on the absurd. In one case, the leak was plugged with 3 canvas yacht sails tied together and stuffed into the breach by hand under pressure. The first tube was holed through on March 11, 1904, almost exactly 24 years after Haskin had first put a shaft into the ground at 15th Street. The second tube followed in 1905. McAdoo himself walked through the completed tube from New Jersey to New York that day, the first man to cross under the Hudson on foot. On February 25, 1908, President Theodore Roosevelt pressed a button in the White House that sent power to the third rail. The tunnels opened to passenger service that night as the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad. Nearly 100,000 people rode them in the first 24 hours. Today, they carry the PATH train. Roughly 200,000 people pass through them every weekday, most of them with no idea that they are riding under the river, through a tube that took 34 years, 2 financial collapses, 21 deaths, and 1 buried reef of rock to complete. The river bottom that stopped the work for 18 months in 1880 is still there. It has not changed. The engineers simply learned, very slowly, how to listen to it.